Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we are finally going to be talking about the newest album from Lindi Ortega called Liberty. So I've talked before about narrative-driven concept records in country music specifically, and while you would think they'd be more common given the genre's penchant for telling stories, I can barely even say that with a straight face anymore, especially in the checklist-driven mainstream scene. But even outside of that, for a country artist to take a real risk and build a coherent, multi-part narrative over an entire album, well, that requires a level of ambition, forethought, and oftentimes budget that can be daunting for any act, especially in the indie scene right now. But that was not gonna stop Lindi Ortega this time. After she broke out in 2012 with the excellent record Cigarettes and Truck Stops that won her a ton of justifiable critical acclaim, most of which carried over to her 2013 follow-up Tin Star, which was also excellent, I had the feeling that she was on the cusp of really taking at least the indie scene by storm, if not more. And yet, while I mostly liked 2015's Faded Gloryville, it was also very clear that her vintage, rockabilly-infused, Dave Cobb-produced Country Lane was starting to lose some of its luster in the face of an increasingly oversaturated scene, and songs that just did not rise to her best. And beyond all that, there's just not a lot of money in that brand of indie country these days, and Nashville is an expensive city to live in. So she left Nashville altogether. She came back to Canada, and she set out to make her most ambitious project to date, putting aside some of the rockabilly tones to something grander and rougher, pulling on spaghetti western bombast like that of Ennio Morricone for the gritty melodrama to come. 3 acts, 15 songs, with tracks in both Spanish and English, blending mariachi with her smoky blend of noir and country rock. I've been wanting to cover this for weeks now, and now that it's finally up my schedule, let's dig in. What did we get on Liberty? Well, honestly, I wish I liked this a fair bit more than I do. Don't get me wrong, Liberty is definitely a return to form for Lindi Ortega, and this was a very good and frequently great country record steeped in the sort of vivid spaghetti western melodrama that is normally a very easy sell for me. It's smoky, it's noir, it cultivates some really terrific moments, and yet the more listens I gave it, the more I got the impression that this album should be gripping me a lot more than it was, and I really struggled to unearth why. So for a change of pace, let's start off with the lyrics and the themes. And remember how I started off this whole thing referencing the whole narrative-driven concept country record? Yeah, for better or worse, you might as well throw that out the window entirely. Because while there is something of a loose arc to this album, to say that there is any coherent story being told would be seriously stretching it. And as soon as I came to that realization that the songs are much more about capturing a very specific snapshot of lurid melodrama that can feel increasingly tangled in the storytelling, well, a lot like many of those old spaghetti westerns of which this record is clearly fond, it was easier to get into the right mindset. From the blood-splattered descent into darkness of the first act, to the comeback and slow revelation of new love on the second, something that's a little bit more wistful and yearning and yet triumphant on the third, freedom being found in culture embraced. And like Hooray for the Riff Raff's narrative-driven concept album The Navigator last year, one of the best albums of last year, it ends with the protagonist singing in Spanish and toasting to newfound freedom, at least in her own heart, riding off into the sunset. And this is where we're going to run into the first big issue. While I'd argue that the niche and sound that Lindi Ortega has chosen is unique enough in indie country, even these days, it was really damn hard to avoid comparisons to similar albums in the genre, like The Navigator, or even some analogous tones off of Whitney Rose or Courtney Marie Andrews. And thus, you find yourself going into the writing to pick out some of those lyrical details that would make these songs seem more distinct and stand out, and it's hard to feel like you're getting all that much. Many of these tracks feeling rather threadbare when it comes to distinctive lyrical detail or lurid texture in order to set the scene. This is where I'd argue the record could have done a bit better in order to flesh out the narrative. Not just because we need a strictly defined story, but because it would make the individual songs and moments feel more distinct and memorable. Hell, it probably could have even enhanced some of the melodrama to capture more of those details in writing. She wouldn't have to turn down the broad strokes of the language being used here. It's always going to be overheated. Just amp up some of the color and some of the grit. And what's exasperating is that, well, Lindi Ortega had done that before, and it's very easy to point to records like Cigarettes and Truck Stops and Tin Star and see analogous arcs and songs but with more distinctive lyrical character, at least when you take a look at some of the details. Now, of course, what helps Lindi Ortega in a big way to compensate for some of that is her delivery and presentation. The mix gives her ample space to vamp effectively, and man, she delivers. From the dark, witchy noir of the album's first half to the more love-struck sincere yearning of the second. And I have heard some people argue the reverb is a tad bit heavy on some of her vocals, but for the larger-than-life broad language and melodrama that this record's trying, it definitely has its place, especially when you're playing its relatively traditional minor key country compositions, which eventually evolved to pick up more chord structures from salsa and mariachi as the album then progresses. And you know what? Even with that, there are some genuinely terrific songs that comes out of it. The warped sizzle of You Ain't Foolin' Me, the very deep acoustic touch slow, dark burn of both Afraid of the Dark and Darkness Be Gone, or the bright inflections of harmonica that infuse the great melodic structure of Lovers in Love, which is widely being recognized as the best song on the album, and for damn good reason. It's genuinely great. However, despite some traditional, strong compositions here, there was a part of me that never really got sucked into the atmosphere much as I was hoping, and finding the right word to describe why, that's tricky. Initially I was thinking kitschy, especially given how garish and broad and borderline cartoonish the record opens up with a springy low end and the squonks of guitar, and it would be so easy to slot this sort of melodrama into that lane, but thankfully it's not a consistent feel for the record. It's often a lot more straightforward. It actually earns some of that more of that grit. But what might be a better word is artificial, and perhaps some of this was shaped by unfair expectations on my part in terms of more grit and sizzle in order to flesh out the atmosphere. Again, I've got easy comparisons that got that right, but don't get me wrong, like, you can get some of it with the noisier bass pickup and some of the lingering spiky guitar tones. But for as much as I might think, say, The Comeback Kid is a great song, and it is, I'm left thinking that it could rise slightly above the chintzy spook house melodrama if it was willing to get a little bit nastier, a little bit truly darker. Now granted, I understand that the narrow line between serious and kind of silly has always been kind of blurred in spaghetti westerns, but this record has enough songs that nail that tonal balance and take themselves a little more seriously, that the moments where the smoother crack show are a little more incongruous. I'm just thinking that a little bit more wild experimentation in the production or instrumentation or composition might have tipped its balance in the right way. Hell, it's a concept album. If there's any format that allows you to get away with that sort of indulgence, it would be this one. But as a whole, man alive, I wish I could call this a great album, because for some of the ambition and the color and some of the best compositions and arrangements of Lindi Ortega's entire career, it feels like it's on the cusp of really getting there. But the more listens I gave it, the more I found myself wishing that the production and the writing, it cut a little deeper. And then I found myself thinking back to those spaghetti westerns that inspired a lot of this album and realizing, in truth, if we're all being honest, many of them had similar tonal issues in terms of that balance. And I can't deny that Lindi Ortega tapped into the broad strokes of the aesthetic very effectively, warts and all. But at the same time, maybe a little bit more texture would have gotten all the way there for me, which leads me to give this an extremely strong 7 out of 10 and a recommendation, especially if you're a fan of this sort of hyperbolic, lurid B-movie western that can really be a ton of fun. Now, it's not for everybody, you need to be into this niche, but hey, if Lindi Ortega's narrative is one of a comeback out of uncertain darkness, which you think that might parallel some things in her real life, it's a record that mirrors it, and it can be a real treat to behold. Definitely check it out. It's worth it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know I'm late to the punch with this. It only just now got off my schedule. When it comes to these sort of weird indie country records, that happens. You want to buy it? Links down below. And I got the poll up there. I'm curious where you guys fall on this. I'm not sure it's better than Tin Star Cigarettes and Truck Stops, but I think it's in that lane. I'm curious where you guys fall on it specifically. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process so I can cover records like this earlier, link to my Patreon is right over this. Where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors, you guys get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. More details right over there. Keep in mind it's now a per month structure instead of per video, so you can get more bang for your dollar. If you want to see my schedule, it's links to my Instagram down there below. Until next time, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.